So first, let us see various things about constructor. So the constructor, this is our constructor. So what we are doing in constructor, we are initializing these particular variables. So as you can see, we are initializing name with N, salary with S, this is S only, and bonus with B. Okay, so as you can see, this is looking like just like a function. So this is a function, this has the function has a name, it has a set of parameters, and we are performing our function here. But what is the difference between a function and a constructor is that, number one, the class name is same as the constructor, or better to say it that the constructor name is same as the class name. So as you can see that if my class name is employee, then my constructor will also have the name employee. And we don't have any return type. We don't have any return type in constructors. So first we have class name same as constructor. Next we don't have return types in constructor. Better to say no return types, and there can be 0 or more parameters. So here we have used 3 parameters. So again, it is not necessary that if I'm initializing the variables, then I'll use the same constructor, and if I'm using the constructor, I'll use the constructor to initialize all the variables. So here there are 3 variables. It is not necessary that I will initialize these 3 variables in this constructor only. Here I'm using this 3 parameters to initialize these 3 variables. It may happen that I don't want to initialize the name. Let's say I just want to initialize salary and bonus. So we can pass just 2 parameters. So constructor can take 0 or more parameters. And one more thing to note is that we can have more than one constructor in a class. So again, let's say this is one of our constructors. So let's say I want to initialize salary and bonus in a different constructor, and I want to initialize name in a different constructor. We can create different constructors for that. So before we go on to see that how do we do that, we come up with this question that when a constructor is called and how all this thing of initialization happens. So the constructor gets called at the very place the object gets created. So this is again one of the big difference between normal methods and constructor is that you can always call a method. You can always call a method, but you cannot call a constructor here and there. The constructor gets called itself when a new object is created. So let's say I have to call this constructor. How do I create the object? So whenever I do this, employee, let's say emp is equal to new employee, and when I'm creating this particular object, since I want to initialize these 3 things, I will have to pass the values. So let's say I pass the value Ram, and let's say I pass the amounts. So what happens when this particular object is created? At this place only this constructor gets called and these variables get initialized. So this is how a constructor gets called. You cannot simply make an object of employee and call this constructor. So like object dot method, what we were using to call other methods, this gets called at the very place the new object gets created. So we have seen that how a constructor looks and how do we call a constructor. Coming back to the point that we can have more than one constructors in a class. We can have 0 or more constructors in a class. So when we have a 0 constructor, so in this particular case, as you can see that we did not put any constructor, we did not define any constructor. So when you don't have any constructor in the class, a default constructor is evoked. We have default constructor. So there will be by default a constructor in that particular class in which you haven't defined any particular constructor. In case you have defined a constructor, then there won't be this default constructor. But in case you haven't defined, Java provides you a default constructor. What this default constructor does is it sets a default value. So when I'm talking about default value, for all the objects, it sets the default value to null. For all the numerical things, it sets the default value to 0. For Boolean, it sets the default value to false. So in this case, we haven't defined any constructor. So what will happen when we create the new object employee, the default constructor gets called. So let's see how default constructor looks like. So let's see how our default constructor will look like. This is how our default constructor will look like. It won't have any parameters and it will initialize all the variables to its default value. Since name is an object, string object, it will initialize it with null. Salary and bonus will be initialized with floating point 0 accordingly. So this default constructor is something which is not visible to you. So in case you haven't written any constructor, this default constructor won't be visible to you, but this is what is called by default in the backend. You won't be able to see, but this is what is getting called in case you haven't written a constructor. Now, as I've said before, that you can have more than one constructor in your class. So let's say I have two constructors. So let's try to write two constructors. Now let's say we have these two constructors in our class. We have a constructor employee which accepts a single parameter, initializes just the name, and then we have again a different constructor which takes 3 parameters and initializes all the. So when we are creating an object, how the compiler knows that which particular constructor should be called. So here comes the concept of constructor overloading. What happens in case of constructor overloading is that the constructor is called based on the parameters type and the number of parameters. So let's say in case I want that this constructor should get called. So how do I create the object? So what's happening here? I am passing just one parameter. So what happens is that Java compiler looks that searches for the constructor that is having just one parameter and the data type is same as this particular parameter. So it sees that okay, this is a string and this is a single parameter. So this particular constructor gets called. This constructor does not get called at that moment. So if we are creating the employee object like this constructor does not get called. Now let's say I want that this constructor should get called. I want all the 3 parameters to be initialized. So in that case I will create object like this. Okay, avoid the numbers. So now what happens? We have 3 parameters. Now it will go and check that which particular constructor is having 3 parameter and having the data type same as string, float and float. So it sees that okay, this is not the match, this is the match. So in this particular case, this constructor gets called. So this is one of the concepts of constructor overloading. What happens in constructor overloading is that you have different constructors, you have more than one constructor, and depending upon the parameters that you are providing, depending upon the number of the parameters and the data types of the parameter, the particular constructor gets called. This is constructor overloading. So it may happen that we have 2 different parameters, we have 2 different constructors that have single parameter. So now let's take an example. Let's say I have one more constructor. So we have one more constructor here. This constructor is also having single parameter and this constructor is also having single parameter. So now when we have the same number of parameters, what compiler does is it checks the data type. So when let's say I create a new object and I create a new object like this, what will happen? It will check that, okay, this is having single parameter, but the data type is not same. This is string and this is float. So it will ignore this. It will ignore this constructor and it will go on to this particular constructor, and this particular constructor gets executed. So this is how you can have multiple constructors. You can initialize different variables depending upon your use case. You can make the constructors, you can create the constructors and create the objects accordingly. This was constructor overloading. Constructor overloading is a very commonly asked question, so make sure you understand this.